It's a real pleasure to be here. This is a big problem. At the moment, our legacy is going to be all kinds of plastic in the oceans where it has no business. But that legacy is also plastic, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we can make it change. On May 6th, the world woke up to the very real possibility that up to 1 million species could be driven to extinction by human activities. This is the report, the UN Nature report, a landmark study that was absolutely the most authoritative of its kind ever. I had the privilege to be one of the coordinating lead authors. The bad news in this report was abundant. If you look across all groups of living organisms, some fraction of species, and in some cases getting up to nearly half, are at risk of extinction. And of course, this isn't only about species, it's also about all of the things that we derive as benefits from nature, including the provision of clean water, of soils that help us to grow our foods, and of the wetlands that help to prevent flooding. So you've heard already today from our wonderful speakers about how when you think about plastics, you might be thinking about water bottles and toothbrushes and flip-flops, but what you should really be thinking is about direct impacts on nature. And then also the other ones about how plastic gets into our food supply, and then also the food supply of other organisms, who at the top of the food chain, they don't have the choice of what they're going to eat, and they can't help but eat these kinds of things. So last summer, you might have heard about the orca who carried her dead stillborn baby around for 2 weeks on her nose, just around Vancouver and Victoria. The top predators in these systems are often the most vulnerable, and they bioaccumulate the pollutants that come out of these plastics. The problem, as you've already heard, is so much more than just how we dispose of the things that we buy. Michelle talked a lot about how these are supply chain problems, right? Plastics are produced at every step in the production of all of the things that we buy. This is a source map of a typical laptop computer showing all of the different places that might be sites of extraction and then production of components and then the assembly into the finished product. If we're going to solve these problems, we have to solve them well outside of our home. And so it's great to hear that Corona, for example, is taking steps to prevent that waste from ever getting in there, and then Unboxed also working from another part of the supply chain. But when you think about the rest of us and how we can participate in this kind of a change, what you're told so often is to buy things differently. And that often means participating in certification, which is great, right? It's a really important way to change supply chains, but it's also limited. Because what it means is you take a supply chain that's fat and benefits from the economies of scale, and you produce a separate supply chain that is thin, and so doesn't benefit from the economies of scale, doesn't move as many products along the shelves, is therefore more expensive, often less fresh, and a lot more complicated because it results in a whole array of different labels, of which for a single product category, there may be up to half a dozen, each of which means something different, some of which are meaningful, some of which aren't. How is a consumer supposed to process all of this and turn it into useful action? The reality is that most people just check out. It's fodder for greenwashing, which leads to a further erosion of trust, and most people just suffer from analysis paralysis. So what happens is that the heroes in the room, and you've heard from a bunch of them today, and I bet there's a bunch in the audience, those who go to any lengths to try to reduce their impacts on this planet from plastic pollution and all kinds of other sources, unfortunately, are not inspiring to the vast majority of other people. What happens is most people look upon those heroes and they say, if it takes that much effort to try to be an environmentalist on this planet, then I'm not one and I can't be one. And so they check out. But our research in my lab, and also in many labs that do research of this kind, shows that the values of environmental responsibility are actually shared very broadly. So we asked a range of different populations in Costa Rica and in Canada and the US about questions like this. Humans have a responsibility to account for our own impacts to the environment because they can harm other people. And we found that the vast majority of people agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. So how do you turn that kind of broad agreement about the fundamental values of responsibility into broad action across all of the population? You make it easy, enjoyable, and inexpensive. And so imagine being able to go into a grocery store, any grocery store, not just Unboxed Market, and being able to buy shrimp that, unlike most shrimp, which unfortunately comes with a side of albatross and sea turtles in the form of bycatch, so incidental catch that was not intended, up to 4 pounds to 10 pounds for every pound of shrimp. Imagine that the net impact of your purchase on the oceans was positive, because there were side payments that went towards fishermen installing turtle excluder devices, perhaps in other fisheries, and then to various programs like the ones you've heard about to reduce the impacts of the plastics in the supply chain. And imagine that you could do that for any product that you could buy in any store. That would be a supply chain for virtue, where acknowledging that we are in a process of transformation where supply chains are becoming greener, but we don't have time to wait for that slow change. We create a separate supply chain to fix those problems, where we accept the responsibility that goes with that, so as to incentivize having less of those problems in the first place. That, we argue, would be the infrastructure for sustainability. Bullet trains and mass transit are great, but I've never ridden on a bullet train, and I don't know when I'll get to. But everybody needs some way to mitigate the impact of their purchases, because we're all participating in loads of supply chains. So in terms of plastics, heard about loads of different kinds of solutions, from fixing landfills, creating real recycling programs that actually reuse that plastic, having beach, river, ocean, lake cleanups, etc., and also creating a circular economy that doesn't need plastic in the first place. This is what we call Cosphere, for a community of small planet heroes, which is working to make it easy, enjoyable, and inexpensive for people to have net positive impacts on our planet. The point here is that we have been giving guidance to the environmentalists who are willing to do anything in order to help the cause. And there are some Katniss Everdeen's out there, and there are some of them in this room. But we need to be able to create solutions that are workable for everybody so that these changes can become a real revolution. That big UN report that I mentioned acknowledged the necessity of transformative change and moving towards a global sustainable economy, which has multiple components, including the one that I'm talking about, unleashing the values that are already there through widespread collective and organizational action. Now, a couple of weeks ago in Paris, 132 member nations signed on to this, and Canada was one of them. Unfortunately, however, that agreement, that assessment does not itself come with any binding agreements, any binding commitments, and so it's up to us to hold their feet to the fire, to make sure that these changes are actually implemented. So a group of us started this Citizens Call for a Global Sustainable Economy for transformative change, to start organizing towards holding governments and also businesses accountable, to do the kinds of leadership things that Corona and Labatt and others are committing to. So yes, absolutely, we've got a plastic problem, but this is actually one part of a much larger problem with our economy. And it's time for solutions, and some of them are out there. I'd love to have you join us with the Citizens Call and also with Cosphere, which we're going to be launching soon. Thank you very much.